The small homestead sat like a stubborn stone against the endless horizon, its timber walls worn by years of sun and storm. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of cornmeal and coffee, the kind of strong brew that could wake a weary soul from the heaviest sleep. The maid wiped her hands on her apron, glancing toward the doorway where the shadows of the evening stretched long and sharp. She had heard the rumors, whispers from travelers passing through, about the man who lived beyond the hills. His size, they said, was too much for any ordinary folk, and the courage it took to meet him or even glance at him was the kind of bravery the faint of heart rarely possessed. She was nervous, though she tried not to show it. There was a weight in the room, a quiet tension that clung to the walls. The wind rattled the shutters, and she thought she saw shapes moving in the twilight outside. It was the kind of moment that made every sound a signal, every shadow a warning. She straightened her back, trying to steady her breathing, aware that the house felt far too small for the anticipation building in her chest. Her thoughts drifted back to the stories. A man who could lift a wagon with one hand, who moved through the land with a power that seemed almost unnatural. The kind of strength that made people speak in hushed tones, wondering if he was a man or something more. A knock at the door startled her, sharp against the quiet evening. She hesitated, the hand on the latch trembling slightly. Who could it be at this hour, and what did they want? Then the door creaked open, just a crack, and a figure appeared, a man broad as a boulder, his presence filling the doorway before he even stepped inside. He didn't speak at first, only looked at her with calm, steady eyes, the kind that measured and judged without cruelty, but with an unshakable certainty. She felt her heart leap in her chest. There was something commanding in the way he stood, something that made her forget to breathe for a moment. Every tale she had heard about his size and strength seemed suddenly true, yet there was an odd gentleness hidden beneath the sheer force of him, a paradox that pulled her in and made her uneasy at the same time. The maid set her hands firmly on the counter, trying to appear busy, trying to tell herself that she was in control. But the air between them was charged, alive with something she couldn't name. He moved closer, his steps slow, deliberate, filling the room with a rhythm that matched the beating of her heart. And then, without warning, he reached her. Not violently, not aggressively, but with a surety that left no room for doubt. He lifted her from behind, strong and careful, as though her weight was nothing to him, though to anyone else it would have seemed impossible. She gasped, startled by the sheer force and the smoothness of the motion, and for a brief second the world narrowed to the two of them. The creaking floorboards, the whisper of the wind outside, the quiet thrum of her own pulse. "His size is too much for anyone," she whispered under her breath, the words more to herself than to him. She could feel the strength in his arms, the power in his shoulders, and yet, despite the awe and fear, there was a strange safety there. It was not a presence meant to harm, but a presence that commanded respect and attention. Her mind raced, caught between fear and curiosity. Who was he really? Where had he come from? And why had he chosen this isolated place, this humble homestead, to appear now? Every story she had heard seemed to intersect in that moment, spinning together into a web of questions that demanded answers she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. The man's voice was low, carrying a calm that seemed almost unnatural given the raw strength he radiated. "You need not be afraid," he said, each word deliberate, weighted, as if each one mattered more than the last. There was authority in the sound, not the kind that demanded obedience, but the kind that made silence the only fitting response. She nodded, barely able to find her own voice, her mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. The air felt thicker, heavier, as though the space between them carried a tension that would snap if touched too roughly. She felt herself balancing on a knife's edge, aware of the fragility of this moment and yet drawn irresistibly forward by it. Outside, the prairie stretched into shadows that moved with the dying light, and somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of animals stirred. She knew she should speak, should ask who he was and what he wanted, but the questions caught in her throat. There was something about him that silenced the ordinary words, the normal conversations that had once passed between her and the people of this small settlement. Every tale she had ever heard of strength, courage, and danger suddenly made sense as she felt the weight of him behind her, the power in his grip and the quiet certainty in his gaze. The world outside the house seemed to fade, leaving only the room, only the two of them, caught in a moment that promised change. He moved slightly, shifting his stance, and she felt the tension in her own muscles, the way she instinctively tried to balance against his strength. There was a rhythm to it, a push and pull that neither of them needed to speak aloud. Every movement, every slight adjustment, seemed to speak volumes about the understanding growing between them, an unspoken connection that went beyond words or reason. She wondered, not for the first time, if she had ever encountered anyone like him, and the thought made her chest tighten. What he represented was more than physical power, it was certainty, a force of nature that defied explanation, and yet, somehow, it felt strangely inevitable that he had come to her doorstep. The house creaked under the weight of the evening, the wind pressing against the walls as though it, too, were part of this tension. She could feel it in the floorboards beneath her, in the way the shadows clung to the corners, in the faint rustle of the curtains that seemed to echo the uncertainty she felt inside. She wanted to speak, to ask the questions burning in her mind, but each time she opened her mouth, the words failed her. He was too much for ordinary conversation, too powerful for ordinary fears. She realized with a mixture of awe and apprehension that whatever was about to happen could not be reversed, that her life, her understanding of the world, was about to shift in ways she could not yet imagine. Then, just as quickly as the tension had built, a sound from outside cut through the room, a snap of a branch, the faint clatter of hooves on dry earth. His grip tightened slightly, a subtle movement that was more instinct than intention, and she felt herself pulled closer into the shadow of his presence. Her pulse quickened, matching the rhythm of something primal she could not name. There was danger, yes, but there was also protection, a sense that this moment, as frightening as it was, held the promise of something beyond her comprehension. She realized she was standing at the edge of a story that had already begun before she could even understand it, a tale that would carry her far from the small homestead and the safety of the familiar. Her eyes met his, searching for an answer, for a clue, for some fragment of explanation, but his face offered only calm resolve. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken questions, with the promise of action yet to come. She sensed the history behind him, the strength tempered by experience, and the knowledge that whatever had shaped him, whatever had made him this way, was tied to forces she had yet to encounter. She shivered, not from cold, but from the weight of the unknown, aware that this was a crossroads, a turning point, a moment that would define everything that followed. The maid's thoughts raced. She tried to imagine what could have led a man like this to appear at her door. Why fate or perhaps chance had brought them together in this quiet corner of the prairie. She wondered about the stories she had grown up hearing, the legends of strength and courage, of men who could carry more than their own weight, and whether this was one of those moments when myth and reality collided. The wind rattled the shutters again, louder this time, as if echoing the question in her mind, who is he, and what does he want? Her pulse throbbed in her ears, each beat a reminder that life, once ordinary, was about to become something extraordinary. The room felt impossibly small, and yet, for all its tightness, the space seemed to expand with the gravity of his presence. Every detail, the worn floorboards, the chipped paint on the walls, the simple furniture faded into the background, dwarfed by the enormity of what was happening. She felt suspended in a moment that was as fragile as it was powerful, aware that one misstep, one wrong word, could shatter the balance. And yet, despite the fear, there was a pull, an attraction to the mystery of him, to the power that was neither cruel nor gentle, but entirely undeniable. Outside, the sky deepened to a navy blue, the first stars piercing the darkness, distant and cold. She felt herself caught between the mundane and the extraordinary, between the stories she had been told and the reality standing before her. The wind died down slightly, leaving an eerie silence, and in that quiet, the weight of him pressed even more insistently against her senses. She knew that nothing would ever be the same after this night, that the world had shifted on its axis without warning, leaving her suspended between fear and fascination. Her heart pounded in her chest, a drumbeat of anticipation and dread, as she realized she was on the edge of something vast and unknowable. He held her steady, a monument of strength in the dim light, and she understood, suddenly, that this was only the beginning. Whatever stories had been told, whatever whispers had passed from mouth to mouth, could never have prepared her for the reality of him. And yet, for all the uncertainty, for all the danger, there was a strange comfort in the undeniable fact of his presence. The night stretched before them, full of questions and shadows, and she felt, with an almost sickening clarity, that her life was about to change in ways she could not yet imagine. The wind picked up again, tugging at the edges of the doors and windows, as though the prairie itself were alive with anticipation. She looked into his eyes, searching for a sign, any indication of what was to come, but found only steady resolve. He moved slightly, adjusting his grip, and she felt the weight of him settle more fully, a reminder that the ordinary rules no longer applied. Her mind raced with possibilities, danger, adventure, revelation, but there was no time to sort them, no words that could capture the magnitude of the moment. All she could do was hold on, uncertain and alert, aware that the story was just beginning and that nothing in her past could prepare her for what lay ahead. And then, just as her pulse began to settle into the rhythm of the room, a faint, distant sound reached her ears, something unusual, deliberate, and full of intent. Her heart skipped, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. The man's eyes flicked toward the door, alert, measured, and she realized that whatever had brought him here, whatever forces had drawn them together, were far from finished. The night held secrets yet to be revealed, and she sensed, deep in her bones, that the events about to unfold would test courage, strength, and trust in ways she had never imagined. The prairie stretched endlessly outside, and the wind carried whispers of a world waiting beyond the small homestead. She felt the tension coil like a spring, ready to release, and knew with certainty that the moment was hanging on the edge of revelation. One step, one sound, one decision could change everything. And as she held her breath, suspended between fear and awe, the first movement of the story to come began to take shape, leaving her and the audience with a question that demanded an answer. What would happen next, and who would survive the measure of his size and strength? The man's eyes didn't leave the doorway. He seemed to listen not just with his ears, but with his whole body, alert to every shift of sound and shadow. The maid's hands trembled slightly, resting lightly on his forearm, feeling the solid, unyielding muscle beneath his shirt. She had never encountered a man like this before, not in her quiet village, not in any of the tales she had been told by travelers or neighbors. His presence demanded attention, commanded it even when his lips were still. And yet, behind the weight of his shoulders and the strength of his grip, there was something else, a story etched into the lines of his face, a past that had carved him into both protector and force of reckoning. She tried to piece together what she knew. His size alone suggested a life of work, of hardship, but there was more than just muscle in him. There was an intelligence in the way he observed the room, the way his gaze flicked to corners, listening for things she hadn't even noticed. The wind outside carried the faint cries of coyotes, the rustle of grass against itself, and the occasional clatter of distant hooves. It was as if the prairie itself had paused, holding its breath in anticipation, leaving the two of them in a bubble of heightened awareness. Her pulse thumped in her ears, a steady drum of fear and curiosity, and she couldn't help but wonder what had led this man to her doorstep. "Where did you come from?" she finally whispered, her voice breaking slightly, unsure if she even wanted an answer. The question hung in the air like a fragile thread, and for a moment he said nothing. Instead, he turned slightly, letting his gaze sweep the horizon visible through the doorway. He was still aware of her, still holding her securely, but his attention seemed to extend beyond the small kitchen, beyond the homestead itself, to the land that stretched in every direction, endless and unbroken. "I came a long way," he said finally, voice low and measured. There was a weight to the words, a hint that more lay behind them than she could grasp. She wanted to press for more, to understand who he was and why he had chosen this isolated place. But she sensed that his silence was part of a story he was not yet ready to share. She felt the tension of history, of unspoken events pressing against her, a past that had shaped him into something larger than life, something that defied easy explanation. She tried to steady her thoughts, to gather the courage to ask what she truly wanted to know. Why here? Why now? Her words barely reached above a whisper. He tightened his hold slightly, not in force, but in reassurance, and the gesture sent a shiver through her. She realized with sudden clarity that whatever dangers or challenges he had faced, whatever stories had been told of his size and strength, he carried them not as threats, but as tools, as instruments to navigate a world that was often cruel and unyielding. The room felt smaller still, compressed under the weight of his presence. The wind rattled the shutters, carrying the faint scent of dust and smoke from somewhere beyond the hills. She caught herself glancing toward the window, trying to see what he had noticed, but the prairie seemed calm, quiet, almost too still. Yet there was a sense of anticipation in the air, a quiet hum that suggested the land itself had secrets, waiting for the right moment to reveal them. She had always thought of her home as a safe place, a refuge from the world, but in that moment she realized how fragile that sense of security had always been. He shifted his stance again, moving her slightly so that she could see more of the room, the homestead, the small kitchen that smelled of coffee and cornbread. His eyes swept across the walls, noting details with precision, the chipped paint, the scratches on the wooden table, the small knife tucked into a corner shelf. Each movement suggested a careful calculation, a man who had learned to read the world not only with sight but with intuition. And she realized that this strength, this presence, was born not only of size but of experience, of a life that had demanded vigilance, quick thinking, and the ability to act decisively. Her mind began to wander, piecing together fragments of stories she had heard over the years. Travelers spoke of men who could bend iron, lift more than a wagon, or hold their ground against impossible odds. Some said they were touched by forces beyond human understanding. Others claimed they were simply forged by a harsh world, by endless trials that shaped their bodies and minds into instruments of survival. She could see now how the rumors fit this man, though nothing she had imagined could capture the sheer weight of reality in front of her. He was larger, stronger, and more deliberate than any tale, yet the calm in his eyes suggested that his power was measured, controlled, and purposeful. "Do you stay long on the road?" she asked, her curiosity pushing past her fear. He looked at her then, fully, eyes steady and unwavering, and for a moment she felt the pull of that gaze as if it could see not only her outward form, but the thoughts tangled inside her mind. "Long enough to do what must be done," he replied. The words were simple, but the meaning lingered, heavy with implication. She tried to read between the lines, to imagine what tasks a man like this could have undertaken, what battles or journeys had left him so formidable. The thought was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. She realized that her life, once predictable, had now intersected with something vast and unknowable, a force that could alter everything she had known. The kitchen door creaked suddenly, a faint warning, and she flinched, glancing at him. He didn't panic. Instead, he moved with quiet efficiency, positioning himself so that she was shielded, his stance protective yet natural. There was a rhythm to his movements, a familiarity born of necessity, as though he had faced this same uncertainty countless times before. She realized she was learning something about him without words, that he carried vigilance as easily as his own body, that the world had taught him lessons she could barely imagine, and that every step he took was measured against a backdrop of experience far beyond her own. She tried to picture his past, to imagine the places he had traveled, the struggles he had endured. Perhaps he had faced the wilderness in its rawest form. Perhaps he had crossed deserts, mountains, or rivers, carrying more than just supplies, carrying responsibility, fear, and courage in equal measure. She wondered what had shaped him into someone so formidable, yet so careful with those weaker than him. It was a paradox, a mystery she couldn't unravel yet, but it drew her in with every heartbeat. Outside, the horizon deepened, the sky darkening into the rich indigo of early night. The wind shifted, bringing a faint hint of smoke, the distant smell of wood burning somewhere far beyond the hills. Her mind raced with possibilities, with questions that had no answers. What had brought him here, and why had fate chosen this particular homestead? She realized, with a shiver, that whatever story had led him to this point was still unfolding, that the layers of history, experience, and danger were far from complete. She studied him quietly, trying to find some hint of softness, some sign of the man beneath the formidable exterior. There was kindness there, yes, but tempered with steel. There was awareness, intelligence, and a readiness to act that made her pulse quicken. She felt both drawn and wary, caught in the gravity of his presence, aware that every breath, every movement, was a part of the story that was about to take shape around her. The wind whispered again through cracks in the shutters, carrying an invisible signal, a promise of things yet to come. "Do you fear the world?" she asked finally, testing the question, trying to understand the man who held her with such deliberate strength. He didn't answer immediately, only looked at her with eyes that seemed to measure not just her words, but the intention behind them. When he spoke, his voice was calm but firm, carrying an edge that suggested experience beyond her imagining. "Fear is for those who have no reason to move forward," he said. "I have reason enough to face what comes." The words were not boastful, not threatening. They were matter of fact, a simple truth delivered with the authority of someone who had lived it. She felt the weight of them, felt the life behind them, and understood that he carried not just physical power, but a history, a mission, a purpose that drove him forward through the dangers of the world. Her hands twitched at her sides, caught between the need to ask more and the recognition that this was not the time. The prairie beyond the windows seemed silent, but she sensed it was alive with movement, with threats unseen. She knew instinctively that she was at the beginning of something far larger than herself, that the quiet life she had known was already slipping away. And as the man held her, steady and silent, she felt the tension of possibility, of potential danger, and of stories yet to unfold, coil around her like a living thing. She thought again of the tales she had heard, men of immense strength, of courage tested by fire and storm. She realized that legends often spoke in fragments, but the reality of meeting one was overwhelming in ways she had never imagined. He was more than stories, more than whispers in the wind. He was flesh and blood and power, a combination that commanded attention, demanded respect, and left her simultaneously in awe and apprehension. The night pressed closer, the first stars faint in the deepening sky. The prairie seemed to listen, as though waiting for the next movement, the next sound, the next choice. She could feel it in her chest, in the small flutter of nerves and excitement, in the tension between fear and curiosity. The man's size and presence were undeniable, yet the questions remained. Why had he come here? What had brought him to this isolated place, and what would the coming hours demand of them both? She knew, with a certainty she could not explain, that the story was only beginning. The mysteries of his past, the reason for his journey, and the events yet to unfold loomed ahead, vast and unpredictable. The wind whispered again, faint but insistent, as if the prairie itself were urging them forward, and she realized that her life was now bound to a path she could neither fully see nor control. The man's presence filled the room, stretched beyond it, and left her with a mixture of anticipation, fear, and fascination she could not escape. And as the night deepened, as shadows stretched across the walls and the prairie lay silent but watchful, the questions hung in the air like smoke. Who was this man? Where had he come from? And what dangers or wonders would follow in his wake? She felt the pull of the unknown, the promise of stories yet to be told, and understood that she was standing at the threshold of something vast, powerful, and entirely beyond her imagination, leaving every sense alert, every thought caught in the tension of what was to come. The wind had died down, leaving a heavy silence over the homestead. The man held the maid steadily, but he did not move to leave the room. Instead, he kept his gaze on the horizon, alert for any sign of trouble. The prairie, which had seemed calm moments ago, now felt alive in a way she couldn't explain. Each shadow seemed to move with intent, each rustle of grass or distant snap of a twig carrying a subtle threat. She felt the tension coil tight around her chest, a physical weight she could not shake. "Who are you really?" she whispered again, more insistently this time. Her hands pressed lightly against his chest, seeking reassurance. His size and presence were undeniable, but so was the mystery that surrounded him. He shifted slightly, turning so that she could see the strength in his shoulders and the determination in his eyes. There was no arrogance there, only a quiet intensity that made it impossible to look away. "I have a name," he said, voice low and deliberate, "but it is not important right now. What matters is what comes next." The words sent a chill down her spine. She didn't understand what he meant, but she could feel the weight of truth in them. Something was approaching, something beyond ordinary danger, and the man's awareness of it set her nerves on edge. She had never felt the world so alive, so full of silent warning. Outside, the first stars were appearing, faint pinpricks against the darkening sky. The prairie stretched endlessly, flat and unbroken, yet she sensed movement in the distance. Perhaps it was animals, or perhaps it was something else, something far larger than any creature she had ever encountered. Her imagination raced, conjuring images of raiders or wild beasts, but the calm certainty in the man's posture suggested that he already knew what was coming. That knowledge made the moment both terrifying and strangely comforting. "Are we in danger?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He looked at her then, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something concern, maybe, or caution. His gaze swept the land, noting every detail with precision. "Perhaps," he said finally, "but danger is not always visible. Sometimes it waits in silence, growing stronger the longer it is ignored." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. She realized that whatever had brought him here, whatever threats they might face, they were tied to forces she could not yet comprehend. The maid tried to steady herself, focusing on the details of the room, the chipped paint, the rough wooden floorboards, the small knife tucked in a corner shelf. But her mind kept returning to the man, to his strength, to the way he seemed to move through the world as though every step had been measured 1,000 times before. She wondered what had shaped him, what battles he had fought, and what losses had carved the lines into his face. Each thought made her pulse quicken. There was a sudden rustle outside, subtle but deliberate. The man stiffened slightly, his grip on her tightening just enough to remind her of the power he held. She tried to peer through the window, but the darkness made it impossible to see more than vague shapes. Still, the air seemed charged, as if the land itself were holding its breath. She could feel her own body responding, muscles coiling, heart racing, senses alert. She had never experienced anything like this before, and yet, for all the fear, there was a pull she could not resist, a need to understand, to see what lay ahead. "You must stay calm," he said quietly, his voice steady and commanding. She nodded, though it was hard to keep her trembling under control. He shifted again, moving so that she was partially behind him, the strength of his body forming a shield between her and whatever lay beyond the walls. She realized in that moment that his size and presence were not only formidable, they were protective. He was aware of every possible threat, every hidden danger, and she felt a strange reassurance in knowing that he would face whatever came with skill and power. Her mind wandered to the stories she had heard of men like him, giants of the frontier, warriors who could lift wagons, hold back entire gangs, or survive situations ordinary folk could not imagine. None of those tales had prepared her for the reality. He was more than legend. He was force and calculation combined, a man who moved with purpose and measured intent. She tried to imagine the life he had led, the choices he had made, and the weight of responsibility that had fallen on his shoulders. Each thought added another layer of tension, another reason to wonder what the next hours might bring. A faint sound reached her ears, a creak of a branch perhaps, or the footstep of something large moving just beyond the line of sight. The man's eyes flicked toward the door and then back to her. "We are not alone," he said softly. The words were simple, yet they carried a depth of meaning that made her stomach tighten. She felt the pull of curiosity and fear at once, the need to know and the need to retreat coiling together in a knot she could not untangle. He moved with the precision of someone who had navigated danger countless times before. She could feel it in the subtle shift of his weight, the careful placement of his hands, the way his eyes swept every corner of the room. She realized that this was more than instinct. It was training, experience, and perhaps even survival born from necessity. She could sense the history in his movements, a past filled with challenge and confrontation, shaping every action and reaction. "Tell me," she whispered, "why you came here. Why to this place?" He looked at her, and she saw the conflict in his eyes. Part of him wanted to answer. Another part restrained itself. Finally, he spoke. "Some answers cannot be given until the time is right. There are forces at work here that you cannot yet see, and knowledge too soon can be dangerous." The words made her pulse quicken further. There was a mystery here, something larger than the homestead, the prairie, or even the two of them. The threat he sensed was real, and its magnitude was hidden from her understanding. Her thoughts turned to her own life, the quiet routines she had known, the small challenges of managing a household in a remote place. None of that seemed relevant now. The ordinary world had slipped away, replaced by tension and anticipation, by the sense that every decision mattered. She felt both frightened and alive in ways she could not explain, caught between fear of the unknown and the thrill of what might come. Outside, the darkness deepened. Shapes shifted along the horizon, indistinct but deliberate. She could feel the prairie itself as a presence, vast and alive, waiting, watching. And then a sound, a low rumble, distant but unmistakable, reached her ears. The man stiffened instantly, senses extending beyond what seemed possible. She could feel the change in the air, the subtle shift in weight and attention. Whatever had been silent before was now moving, coming closer. "Get ready," he said, voice steady. His words were a command, but not one born of fear, born of preparation. She nodded, heart racing, knowing that she would follow, but understanding that much was out of her control. She could feel the tension in every fiber of her being, the anticipation, the dread, the pull of curiosity. The world outside the homestead was no longer simple or predictable. It was alive with danger, with power, with possibilities she could not yet name. The man adjusted his stance, preparing for what was coming, and she realized how immense his presence truly was. He was more than muscle. He was awareness, experience, and instinct combined. Each motion was precise, measured, practiced. She tried to follow his lead, feeling her own body respond to his guidance, to the rhythms of a man who had faced the unknown countless times before. The tension between them shifted into coordination, a silent understanding that would carry them through what was to come. And yet, even as she tried to focus, her thoughts returned to questions. Who was he really? Where had he come from? What had shaped him into this figure of immense strength and presence? The answers seemed just beyond reach, tantalizing and mysterious. She could sense layers of history, choices, and events that had brought him to this moment, and the thought made her pulse quicken. She was on the edge of something vast, something unpredictable, and her life had already begun to follow a path she could not imagine. The prairie outside seemed to close in, shadows deepening, shapes moving with silent purpose. The wind stirred again, carrying whispers she could not fully hear, hinting at events beyond her comprehension. She shivered, partly from fear, partly from anticipation, and she realized that whatever lay ahead would test more than courage. It would demand understanding, quick thinking, and trust. And all the while, the man remained calm, steady, unshakable, a monument of power and experience in the quiet kitchen. She thought again of the tales of giants and warriors she had heard, of men who could move mountains or lift impossibilities, and she realized that the truth was even stranger. This man carried not only size and strength, but wisdom, skill, and awareness beyond ordinary comprehension. She was caught between fear and admiration, drawn to the mystery and aware that every second mattered. Outside, the night waited. Inside, tension coiled tight. And somewhere, beyond the prairie and the horizon, the first signs of a challenge she could not yet see were moving into place, silent but inevitable. Her pulse quickened again, matching the rhythm of anticipation. The man's gaze remained steady, eyes alert to every detail, every possible threat. She felt herself drawing courage from his presence, even as fear lingered. There were questions without answers, dangers she could not see, and a sense that the story unfolding would demand everything she had and more. The night stretched, waiting for the moment when action would break the tension, and she understood with clarity that what had begun here, in this quiet homestead, was only the first chapter of something larger, more powerful, and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. She held her breath, listening, watching, waiting, and the wind whispered again through the cracks of the old house. Shapes moved beyond the horizon, unseen but certain, and she knew that the unknown was coming closer. The man adjusted his stance slightly, sensing it too, and she felt the weight of what was to come settle over her like a shadow. Whatever was moving in the darkness would not wait, and the night itself seemed poised to test them both. And so they stood together in quiet anticipation, the tension stretching into the hours, the mysteries pressing in from all sides, leaving the story unresolved but impossible to ignore. The darkness beyond the homestead thickened, pressing against the walls like a living thing. The prairie was no longer quiet. It hummed with an energy she could not name. Every shadow seemed to flicker with movement, every sound amplified in the tense stillness of the night. The maid's heart pounded in her chest as she clung to the man's arm, aware of the sheer force behind him and the calm determination that radiated from every line of his body. She knew instinctively that whatever was coming would test everything she had ever known about danger, courage, and survival. He shifted slightly, his eyes scanning the horizon, noting shapes and movement invisible to her. There was a subtle rhythm to his awareness, a precision that left no detail unnoticed. The wind rustled the tall prairie grass, and she thought she saw figures moving among the shadows, blurred, indistinct, yet deliberate. Her pulse quickened. She had been on edge before, but this felt different. This was not just fear of the unknown. This was the weight of impending confrontation, a sense that the world had narrowed to this one place, this one night, and that their fates were intertwined with forces beyond comprehension. "Stay close," he whispered, his voice low but firm. She nodded, gripping his arm tighter, feeling the solid reassurance of his strength. Every instinct told her that his size, his presence, and his awareness would be crucial in what was about to unfold. She could sense his experience, his readiness, and it both comforted and terrified her. She had never been so aware of the fragility of life, nor so keenly aware of the power of one man to hold the balance. A sudden movement caught her eye, a flicker of shadow among the distant grass. She gasped softly, and the man's head snapped toward it, eyes narrowing. He didn't speak, but the tension in his body communicated more than words could. She realized that whatever waited beyond the homestead had been watching, waiting for a sign, a weakness. The air seemed to thrum with anticipation, charged with danger and the promise of action. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise, every nerve on edge, yet she could not look away. The man moved with deliberate care, shifting so that her body was shielded behind him. She could feel the weight of his presence, a barrier between herself and whatever threat lurked in the darkness. His size was more than physical. It was an aura, a presence that seemed to push the fear back even as it heightened her awareness. She realized she was learning from him, absorbing the rhythm of readiness, the subtle movements that prepared them for what was coming. Another sound reached them, faint but unmistakable, the crack of a branch, the snap of something heavy moving over the dry grass. The man's posture tightened, muscles coiling like springs ready to release. She held her breath, feeling the tension tighten around her chest. The night seemed to respond to every motion, the shadows deepening, the wind carrying a restless energy. She could sense that time had slowed, that every second was loaded with possibility, every heartbeat a measure of danger. "Are they alone?" she whispered, the words barely leaving her lips. The man's gaze swept the horizon again, unblinking, unhurried, yet precise. "Perhaps not," he said quietly. His voice carried no panic, only the calm awareness of someone who had faced threats before and had learned to measure them carefully. The words sent a shiver through her, but also a strange reassurance. He knew what they faced, even if she did not, and that knowledge was a lifeline in the growing tension. The shadows moved closer, shapes taking form against the fading light. She could just make out figures tall, dark, moving with a purpose that was deliberate and precise. Her pulse quickened, and the man shifted, positioning himself so that she was fully behind him. She could feel his muscles tense, the force of him ready to spring into action. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to hide, to seek safety, but she also felt an unspoken trust in him, a sense that she needed to stay close and follow his lead. "Whatever they want," he whispered, "they will not find weakness here." The conviction in his voice was steady, unyielding, and it settled something in her chest. She realized that his strength was more than muscle. It was certainty, awareness, and courage forged by experience. She felt the tension in her body shift slightly, coiling into readiness rather than fear, as she understood that survival would demand focus, speed, and the quiet trust she placed in his presence. The figures in the distance moved closer, shapes clearer now, revealing themselves as humans raiders, she guessed, armed and determined. She saw the glint of metal, the movement of weapons, and the calculated rhythm of their steps. Her breath caught. She had never faced such danger before. She looked to him for guidance, and he met her eyes with steady resolve. His grip on her tightened ever so slightly, reassurance and preparation mingled in that single gesture. "They are skilled," he said quietly, almost to himself. "But they have not met me yet." The words sent a ripple of anticipation through her, and she realized that he meant more than confrontation, he meant control, the kind that could shift the balance of life and death with measured effort. She had heard stories of men like him, legends that had traveled across the prairie, but none had prepared her for the reality of standing beside someone who could command the moment with such presence and awareness. The raiders were close enough now that she could see their faces, hardened, determined, ruthless. They moved as one, coordinated, confident in their advantage. Yet the man did not flinch. Instead, he adjusted his stance, each motion deliberate, positioning her so that she was safe yet part of the unfolding plan. She felt herself learning from him instinctively the rhythm of preparation, the awareness of distance, the quiet anticipation of movement. "Do not be afraid," he whispered. "Stay behind me and do exactly as I say." She nodded, unable to find words, but understanding the depth of his command. Every instinct told her that he was not only powerful but skilled, trained to anticipate threats and act with precision. The tension in the air was almost unbearable, the silence before the storm heavy with the weight of potential action. She could feel the fear, the anticipation, and the thrill all at once, coiling tight like a spring ready to release. The raiders paused, scanning the homestead with suspicion. The man's eyes never left them, reading every twitch, every hesitation, every subtle movement. He was a study in control, a force of nature contained in human form, and she could feel the energy radiating from him, a presence that made the attackers hesitate. Her own fear mingled with awe as she realized that survival here would depend not only on physical strength, but on the keen awareness and experience that he carried like armor. A single figure stepped forward, leader of the raiders, and she could see the confidence in his posture, the belief that he had the upper hand. But the man's stance did not waver. He adjusted subtly, shifting his weight, positioning himself as if the space around him belonged to no one but him. She felt the pull of power, the silent warning that whatever happened next would be decisive, and that the balance of control rested on his choices, his strength, and his instinct. The wind picked up again, carrying dust and the faint scent of smoke, adding to the tension that seemed to saturate the night. The maid's breath came in shallow gasps, hard hammering in her chest. She felt the weight of the unknown pressing down, the anticipation coiling tighter with every passing second. Outside, the prairie seemed to shift, alive with the movement of shadows and the subtle threat of violence waiting just beyond sight. Every fiber of her being was alert, caught between fear and fascination as she realized that the climax of the story was approaching, something that would demand courage, precision, and trust beyond anything she had ever known. The raiders advanced slowly, confident but cautious, and she felt the tension in the room thicken. The man's hands flexed slightly, adjusting the position of the maid, and she understood instinctively that he was preparing for action, measuring distance, force, and timing. Every movement was deliberate, precise, honed by experience and necessity. She had never seen anything like it, never felt anything like it, and she realized that the outcome of this encounter would define more than the night, it would shape the future for them both. One of the raiders stepped too close, testing the balance, and the man's eyes flicked toward him with lightning speed. The air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first motion that would shatter the tension. She could feel the potential energy in the room, coiling, tightening, building toward a point that could explode into action at any second. The moment was exquisite in its danger, a precipice of fear and anticipation that left her senses screaming for awareness. "Hold," the man whispered, just above a breath. She felt the authority in the single word, a command that made the air itself seem to pause. The raiders hesitated, caught between their own expectations and the silent, overwhelming presence of the man before them. She realized with clarity that his size and strength were not just physical, they were psychological, commanding attention, respect, and even fear without a single aggressive motion. The wind shifted, carrying a faint sound from beyond the hills, something different from the steps and rustle of the raiders. She could not identify it, but the man's head moved slightly, ears attuned to the nuance. He whispered something under his breath she could not hear, a warning perhaps, a calculation, a plan forming in real time. She felt the suspense coil tighter around her chest, knowing that the tension was reaching its peak, that the story was on the cusp of action, and that the next moments would define whether fear or courage would carry them through. Every shadow seemed to pulse, every movement magnified, every heartbeat a drum in the tense silence. She watched him, the weight of his presence anchoring her in a world that had become uncertain and dangerous. Outside, the raiders shifted, senses heightened, unaware of the full measure of the man before them, unaware that the balance of power was already tipped. And yet the night was not done. Something larger, something unforeseen was moving closer, adding layers of suspense that left her mind racing and her body tense. The first sign of the unknown revealed itself as a faint sound, almost imperceptible at first, then growing a rustle of earth, a snap of branches, a low rumble that vibrated through the ground. The man's eyes narrowed, his body coiling, ready to act. She felt herself drawn into the rhythm of his readiness, a silent dance of anticipation, fear, and determination. Every instinct in her screamed that the climax was near, that the unfolding story was about to demand courage, presence, and quick thinking beyond measure. She could sense it in the shift of his muscles, the flicker of his eyes, the tension in the air that held the homestead, the prairie, and even the night itself in suspense. Something was coming, something that would challenge strength, courage, and will. The raiders were already nervous, the first signs of doubt flickering across their faces. And the unknown beyond them, hidden in shadows and movement, added a force she could not measure, leaving her heart hammering in her chest as she clung to the man whose size and presence had become the anchor of the moment. Every sound, every shadow, every flicker of motion carried meaning. The maid understood that the climax was approaching, though she could not see it fully. She felt the intensity of preparation, the weight of anticipation, and the subtle power of a man whose presence alone had reshaped the night. The wind carried whispers of unknown forces, and the prairie seemed to hold its breath as the moment stretched taut, ready to break in action, conflict, and revelation. And there, in the quiet, tense air of the homestead, the night waited, full of possibilities, danger, and the promise of resolution yet unseen, leaving the audience perched on the edge of suspense, hearts racing and minds eager for the unfolding climax that would decide the fate of both the maid and the man whose size, strength, and presence had transformed the simple homestead into the stage of a story far greater than either of them had imagined. The tension broke like a snapped rope, sudden and violent, yet perfectly controlled. The first of the raiders lunged, and the man moved with a precision that made every action seem inevitable. She barely had time to catch her breath as he intercepted, using strength and leverage to throw the attacker to the ground. The sound of bodies colliding echoed through the empty prairie, but he never let go of her or her safety. Every movement was deliberate, measured, and decisive. She realized in that moment that his size was more than physical, it was the embodiment of control and protection, a presence that could turn fear into strategy. The remaining raiders hesitated, momentarily unsure, their confidence shaken by the swift, almost effortless display of power. The man's gaze swept the field, calculating, predicting, and commanding. He moved again, each motion precise, subduing one, blocking another, forcing retreat after retreat. She could barely follow the speed, the strength, the way he seemed to dominate the space without reckless force. And yet, he was not cruel. Each action protected life even as it defeated aggression. She clutched his arm, pulse racing, the thrill of the moment mingling with deep, instinctive relief. When the last of the raiders fell back into the shadows, uncertainty written across their faces, the man turned to her. His breathing was steady, and his eyes, though alert, carried a quiet satisfaction. The danger had passed for now, but the lessons lingered. He had shown her not just strength, but courage and clarity, and she felt a profound shift inside herself. The world, she realized, was larger and more unpredictable than she had imagined, but with trust and awareness, it was not unconquerable. She studied him then, really looked at him, taking in the way his muscles moved even in stillness, the subtle control in his stance, and the calm intensity of his eyes. "You saved me," she whispered, awe in her voice. He shook his head slightly, almost dismissively. Not just you, he said. Everyone who counts. Strength alone is nothing without purpose and awareness. Remember that. His words settled into her, becoming more than reassurance. They were a guide, a lesson she would carry beyond this night, beyond this prairie, beyond the homestead that had been the center of her world until now. The moon broke through the clouds, casting silver light across the land. She could see the empty fields, the distant hills, and the quiet of a world restored, at least temporarily. The wind carried the scent of burned grass and dust, evidence of movement and struggle, but also the reminder that life went on, that threats could be overcome. She breathed deeply, feeling her body relax for the first time in hours. The man stood beside her, silent and watchful, but there was no tension in his posture now. The threat had passed, and for the first time she felt a sense of calm that wasn't hollow or fleeting. She thought of the questions that had haunted her through the night, the mysteries of his past, the reasons he had come, the life he had led before reaching her homestead. She realized she didn't need all the answers now. His actions had told her more than words could. Courage, protection, awareness, and decisiveness were all that mattered. And in that moment, she understood that these qualities were far more powerful than curiosity about the past. She could trust him, rely on him, and perhaps even learn from him. The man finally relaxed, leaning slightly against the doorway. His eyes swept the horizon once more, noting details she had missed, the tracks in the dirt, the broken branches, the subtle signs of retreating movement. "They will not return tonight," he said, voice steady and calm. "But the world is full of challenges. You must always be aware, always ready." She nodded, taking in the weight of his words. They were not just instructions, they were wisdom distilled from experience, advice she would carry with her for the rest of her life. She finally found the courage to step closer to him, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Why did you come here? Why choose this place?" He looked at her then, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, though his eyes remained serious. "I came because it was needed," he said. "Sometimes the right path is not chosen, it is recognized when it appears. You were here. The threat was here. I did what had to be done." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of truth. He had acted not for glory, not for recognition, but because it was necessary. And that, she realized, defined him more than any legend or story ever could. The night stretched on, stars twinkling above, the prairie quiet except for the faint whispers of wind. She felt a connection to the land she had never known, a bond between herself, the man, and the world around them. Danger had arrived, yes, but so had clarity. Courage, awareness, and action had triumphed over fear, and she felt a deep sense of satisfaction in knowing that even in uncertainty, the right choices could guide the outcome. "Will you stay?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying more hope than fear now. He considered her question, gaze softening slightly. "For as long as needed," he said. "The night is quiet now, but life brings new challenges. You will not face them alone." The words settled in her chest, filling her with warmth, reassurance, and a sense of safety she had not known before. She realized that this was not just about surviving one night, but about forging a bond, a partnership built on trust, courage, and shared experience. They moved inside, checking the homestead for any lingering threats. Every corner, every shadow, every detail was examined with care. She followed him, learning without realizing it, learning the rhythms of preparation, the patterns of awareness, the quiet decisiveness that turned fear into protection. She could feel her own confidence growing with each step, each action, each realization that survival was not about panic, but about understanding, awareness, and courage. By the time the first light of dawn began to touch the prairie, the homestead was secure. The world outside was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of early morning. The air carried the scent of dew and earth, a reminder that life moved forward even after danger had passed. She looked at the man, at his calm, steady presence, and felt a profound gratitude, a respect that went beyond words. He had brought more than strength. He had brought clarity, safety, and the understanding that courage and wisdom could shape outcomes even in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. They stepped outside together, surveying the land that had threatened them just hours before. The tracks of the raiders had faded with the night, but the lessons remained. She realized that she would never see her world the same way again. Fear had been replaced with awareness, uncertainty with preparedness, and doubt with trust. And as she stood there, hand in his, she felt the quiet strength of a future full of possibility, guided by courage, wisdom, and the presence of someone who had shown her the power of purpose and action. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, quiet, still, and yet alive with potential. The sun rose, casting long golden rays across the fields, illuminating every detail. She felt a sense of triumph, not just over the night's danger, but over the fear that had kept her small, cautious, and limited. The man beside her had shown her that size, strength, and courage were not merely physical, they were tools, instruments to navigate life's challenges with clarity and purpose. She knew she had grown through the night, and that growth would carry forward into every moment that followed. They walked together toward the small barn, toward the homestead, toward a life that had already been altered by the events of the night. The prairie seemed to stretch behind them like a memory, a reminder of danger and the triumph over it, while ahead lay a horizon filled with promise. The maid realized that safety was not the absence of threat, but the presence of preparedness, courage, and trust. She felt a warmth in her chest as she understood that this man, this presence, had changed her life in ways she could not yet fully name. "Thank you," she said quietly, voice steady now, free of the tremor of fear. He looked at her, eyes calm and softening, a hint of warmth behind the intensity. "No thanks needed," he replied. "The right thing was done." "That is enough," she smiled, understanding finally that heroism was not about accolades, but about action, awareness, and the protection of those who could not defend themselves. It was a lesson she would carry always. The day grew brighter, the prairie alive with the soft movements of animals and the gentle whisper of wind through the grass. The homestead felt more secure, the world more manageable, and yet she understood that life was never without challenge. What had happened in the night had changed her, shaped her, and given her knowledge she would use again and again. And beside her, the man remained vigilant, calm, and steady, a reminder that courage and strength, guided by wisdom and purpose, could turn even the most terrifying night into a story of triumph and hope. As they stood together, surveying the horizon, she felt a sense of peace settle over her, a deep understanding that even in a world of uncertainty, life could be guided by courage, trust, and purposeful action. The prairie stretched endlessly, but for the first time, she felt it was not intimidating, it was full of opportunity, full of life and full of the promise of days where strength and wisdom could shape the future. The story of that night, the threat, and the triumph would remain with her forever. And as she looked at the man who had brought clarity and protection, she realized that endings were not simply about what had passed, they were about what had been learned, what had been gained, and what could be carried forward. The horizon glowed with the morning sun, and in that light she knew that the world was wide. Challenges would come, but courage, trust, and purpose would always guide the way forward. She took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the morning and the solid presence beside her. The homestead, the prairie, and the memories of the night would remain, but so would a new understanding of strength, courage, and the bonds formed in the face of danger. And in that quiet moment, she knew that happiness, safety, and hope were not distant dreams. They were here, present and possible because of action, awareness, and the power of doing what was right when it mattered most. Hand in hand, they turned toward the rising sun, toward a day full of promise, knowing that while the world was vast and sometimes dangerous, They had the courage, the wisdom, and the presence to face it together. The night had passed, the danger had ended, and in its place came clarity, peace, and the beginning of a life shaped by strength, purpose, and the quiet power of hope.